This is the next video in sentence diagramming. We're going to focus on two elements today in sentence diagramming. The first is how to diagram something called helping verbs, and the second is how to address diagramming questions. Now, if you recall from the first sentence diagramming video, we learned that every independent clause, every thought that can stand alone, has at its core two ingredients: a subject, that's what the sentence is about, and the predicate, that tells us what about the subject. And we took a look at three basic sentence patterns. The first of which was a subject and an action verb, like dogs bark. The second was a subject, an action verb, and a direct object being acted upon. So, for example, we can have the girl kicked the ball. And the last was a complement. We have a subject, a linking verb or state of being verb, and then the complement. So she is late, for example. Those are the basic sentence patterns, but obviously words and sentences can get more complicated. And in the basic patterns, we only dealt with verbs in their simplest form, either present or past. So we can change the tense in which verbs occur in a couple different ways. And when we do that, a lot of times we add something called helping verbs. So we have to learn how to diagram. Helping verbs, you can look at the definition on the screen, are verbs that, as the name suggests, help the main verb in some way. By extending the meaning of the verb, they add detail to how time is conveyed in a sentence. As a result, helping verbs are used to create the most complicated verb tenses in English, something called the progressive and perfect aspects. Now, I don't really care for the purpose of this if you understand the nuances of progressive tense versus perfect tense. But I want you to be able to identify the helping verbs by understanding that they're changing when something occurs. They're setting up a condition for when something occurs. So we'll take a look at some basic examples here. The first two sentences we have, number 1 and 2, should provide a review. We can have a main verb. In the first sentence, grow is our main verb, okay? So if you recall how we diagram this, we have a subject, that's what the sentence is about, flowers. And what do? Firewall, they grow. Pretty simple. Same thing with number 2. The subject of the sentence is bunnies. What about those bunnies? They hop. Both action verbs, you'll notice. Now let's take a look at number 3, and here's where helping verbs come in. Now we can say birds chirp, right, in the same way that we say bunnies hop. But now we're changing the tense in which they are doing that chirping. It's past tense, but it's also progressive because we have chirping being present tense. It's happening. They were chirping. Okay? It's something called past progressive. Now, I don't really mind, like I said, that you understand past progressive tense and be able to identify. What I do mind and what I do hope is that you can identify that were is simply changing the tense in which the verb is happening. It's also a verb. And don't forget that when we learned our state of being verbs, were was one of those state of being verbs, right? Oftentimes, helping verbs are state of being verbs. So let's diagram it. Birds is our subject. Now, still have our firewall. The only difference here is that we're adding our helping verb. Now, luckily for you, you don't have to do anything more than just put them next to the main verb. So they go right on that line, right next to the main verb. This is your helping verb, HV, and this is your main verb. Okay, the main verb being the main action in the sentence. Okay, were is simply helping it out, telling us we're changing the tense. Now, you can probably see Sydney has been playing is very similar. We could say Sydney plays in present tense, but now we're changing the context in which it occurs. Sydney is still my subject. What did she do? She has is a helping verb. Been is a helping verb. and playing is a helping verb. It's a main verb, excuse me. So the whole phrase is has been playing. Has and been are helping verbs, and our main verb is playing. Together, they create what's called a verb phrase. Okay, so has been playing would be considered the verb phrase, the complete verb phrase. Were chirping would be the verb phrase of number 3. Okay, so diagramming helping verbs, just to review very simply, is just adding that helping verb, recognizing it, and then adding the helping verb right next to the main verb. And here's a little chart that kind of reviews what we just went over. Subject, firewall, helping verb or verbs, as in the case of number 4, you can have more than one, and then the main verb. Now let's take a look at some of these helping verbs. This might help you remember them. There's only so many helping verbs in our language, so it can help you to learn them by memorizing this little song that I'm going to share with you. Okay, this chart shows us all the helping verbs. And the song is a really simple one to a tune you probably recognize. So I'm going to sing it now. Be, am, is, are, was, were, been, being, had, has had, could, should, would, may, might, must, shall, can, will, do, did, does, having. So if you remember that little tune, which sounds a little silly, you'll remember the list of helping verbs. So I would encourage you to try and do that if you can, and those are used in different contexts to change a tense to either progressive or perfect in which a verb is happening, essentially. Okay, so that's helping verbs. Now let's take a look at how to diagram questions, which is going to play in to our conversation about helping verbs. So, in all the contexts so far of the sentences we've diagrammed, they've all been statements. And in our regular statements in English, we always put the subject in front of the verb. So it's always subject doing a verb, so subject predicate. But with diagramming questions, that order, that typical order, subject followed by verb, is scrambled a bit. So it can be hard to find the subject in a question. So what I always tell people to do is before you diagram a question, find the subject by flipping that question into a statement, okay? And it's done exactly like this. Have you been cooking? Question. If we flip that into a statement, would be, you have been cooking. And hopefully, when you look at that, you'll realize that the subject doing the verb, doing the cooking, is you. And have been cooking is our predicate. It answers the question, what about you? So now we can diagram. Now notice that when I diagram, I'm going to pay attention to the capitalization and punctuation. So, you have been cooking becomes, you is my subject, notice it's not capitalized, firewall. Have and been, those are my helping verbs that we learned in the past segment. Cooking. Notice I add the question mark at the end of cooking, and I have to capitalize have here because have is capitalized at the start of the sentence. And that lets me know if I'm seeing the diagram without the original sentence that this was in fact a question. Have being the first word in the sentence, have you been cooking? Notice it scrambles the subject and the predicate. In questions oftentimes, the helping verb will be, the question will start with the helping verb and the main verb will be after the subject, okay? And that's what you have here. Have is one of the helping verbs and our main verb is cooking. Okay? Let's take a look at number 2. Has Lucy been reading? We're going to flip that around into a statement. We would say, instead of has Lucy been reading, Lucy has been reading. And now we can diagram. Okay? So, our subject is what the sentence is about. In this case, it's about Lucy. Firewall. We ask ourselves, what about Lucy? She has been reading. We have to capitalize that helping verb has. Been is a helping verb as well, changing the tense, and reading is our main verb. And you can probably guess how to do number 3. May I run becomes I may run. And now we diagram it. So that becomes essentially I, firewall. May should be capitalized because it was capitalized as our helping verb at the start of that question. And by the way, questions are called interrogative statements, if you ever hear that. And run is your main verb. Okay? Question. So, today we learned about diagramming helping verbs and what they are with some examples. And we also learned how to diagram questions by flipping them into statements. And notice that the questions, these interrogative statements, that they will have helping verbs embedded in them, which hopefully you'll be able to pick up by learning that little song that I so beautifully sang. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more videos on diagramming sentences.